Jezebel is one of the most intriguing figures of the Bible, known for her role as Queen of Israel and wife of King Ahab. Her story is told primarily in the first book of Kings, and her name has become synonymous with a corrupt and idolatrous leader. Jezebel is not remembered for her good deeds, but for her opposition to God and her cruelty toward the prophets of Israel. She was of Phoenician origin, the daughter of Ethbal, king of the Sidonians, and her marriage to Ahab, king of Israel, was a shrewd political move aimed at strengthening alliances between the two kingdoms. By marrying Ahab, Jezebel brought with her not only political connections but also the religious influence of the Sidonians, especially the worship of the gods Baal and Asherah. These gods were central to the culture and religion of the Sidonians, and Jezebel was a fervent defender of their cult. Once she became queen, Jezebel used her power to promote the worship of these foreign gods in Israel. She built temples and altars dedicated to Baal and Asherah, in direct challenge to the worship of Israel's God, Yahweh. This move not only altered religious practices, but also profoundly influenced the culture and morality of the kingdom. The result was a period of great spiritual corruption, in which the true worship of God was suppressed and replaced by pagan practices. Jezebel became a central figure in the promotion of idolatry and the rejection of the principles that had guided Israel from its earliest days. As Queen of Israel, Jezebel not only shared the throne with Ahab, but she exerted a powerful influence over him and the kingdom. Her impact was profound and negative, especially with regard to Israel's religion and morality. Jezebel brought with her the worship of Baal and Asherah, and her determination to promote these pagan practices knew no bounds. Her influence over Ahab was so great that he became an ardent advocate of the worship of these foreign gods, even if it meant departing from the principles of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Jezebel was not content with merely changing religion. She also actively sought to eradicate the worship of God. One of her most cruel acts was the systematic persecution of the Lord's prophets. She instigated the killing of many of them, creating a climate of fear and oppression. A notable example of this persecution is the account found in 1 Kings 18 verse 4, which describes how Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord. This act of violence was not only an attempt to silence the voice of God, but also a strategy to consolidate her own power and ensure that the worship of Baal and Asherah would be the only form of worship permitted in the kingdom. Her policy of terror included not only the physical elimination of the prophets, but also a campaign to discredit and demoralize anyone who opposed her plans. Jezebel used fear and violence as tools to secure the loyalty of those around her and to prevent any challenge to her rule. This climate of repression and idolatry caused many Israelites to turn away from the true worship of God and adopt the pagan practices that Jezebel promoted. Jezebel became a feared and hated figure for many in Israel. Her determination to eradicate true worship and her cruel persecution of God's prophets left an indelible mark on the history of the kingdom. Her negative influence on Ahab and the kingdom led to a period of great spiritual and moral corruption, making Jezebel a symbol of tyranny and rejection of what is sacred. In this scenario, the prophet Elijah stands out as one of the greatest opponents of Jezebel and her idolatrous regime. The confrontation between them reaches a climax in the episode on Mount Carmel, one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible. In this episode, Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal to a public confrontation to demonstrate who the true God is. 1 Kings 18 verses 20 to 40. The competition consists of each group preparing a sacrifice and calling on their God to send fire from heaven to consume it. During the challenge, the prophets of Baal try in vain to get their God's attention. They shout, dance, and even stab each other with swords, but nothing happens. Elijah, on the other hand, prepares his sacrifice, places it on an altar, and orders water to be poured over it to further demonstrate God's power. Elijah then prays to the Lord, and God responds with fire that consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the surrounding water. This event demonstrates in a powerful and unmistakable way that Yahweh is the true God, and not Baal. Elijah's victory over the prophets of Baal should have been a turning point that led to Israel's reconciliation with God. However, Jezebel's response reveals her stubbornness and her contempt for God's power. Rather than acknowledge Yahweh's supremacy, Jezebel sends a threatening message to Elijah, promising that he will be killed before the end of the next day. 1 Kings 19 verse 2. Jezebel's response not only demonstrates her refusal to accept defeat, but also reveals the depth of her resistance to God and her determination to continue promoting Baal worship despite being publicly challenged and disavowed. The Mount Carmel incident and Jezebel's subsequent threat highlight the queen's stubbornness and unwavering commitment to her pagan beliefs, regardless of clear evidence of divine truth. Her reaction also illustrates how those deeply involved in corrupt practices can become even more stubborn when confronted with the truth. One of the darkest and cruelest episodes in Jezebel's life is the conspiracy that resulted in the death of Naboth, a righteous man who was faithful to God. Naboth owned a vineyard located near Ahab's palace, and the king wanted to acquire the property to expand his gardens. However, Naboth refused Ahab's offer, stating that the vineyard was a family heirloom and that he could not sell it, according to the precepts of Israelite law, 1 Kings 21 verses 2-3. Jezebel, known for her willingness to use any means to achieve her goals, was undeterred by Naboth's refusal. She devised an evil plan to ensure that the vineyard would fall into Ahab's hands. Jezebel wrote letters on Ahab's behalf, ordering that Naboth be summoned to a banquet and there falsely accused of blasphemy and treason against God and the king. These accusations were accompanied by an order that Naboth be stoned to death, 1 Kings 21 verses 8-10. Jezebel's plot was effective. Naboth was convicted and executed on the false charges. After Naboth's death, Jezebel informed Ahab that the vineyard was available, and the king immediately took possession of the property, 1 Kings 21 verses 15-16. This act not only demonstrated Jezebel's lack of ethics and justice, but also evidenced her willingness to use her power and influence to satisfy her own desires and those of her husband, without regard for law or morality. Naboth's death is a clear example of how Jezebel used cruelty and manipulation to consolidate her power. Her actions were not only a violation of the rights of a righteous man, but also an affront to the principles of justice and righteousness that were supposed to govern the kingdom. This episode underscores Jezebel's tyrannical and inhumane nature, and how her influence corrupted justice and morality in Israel. After Ahab's death, Jezebel's influence remained a significant concern for God's prophets. Elisha, Elijah's successor, received a divine message foretelling Jezebel's fate. In 2 Kings 9 verse 10, Elisha prophesied that Jezebel would be thrown out of a window and her body would be devoured by dogs, a death sentence that symbolized complete disgrace and divine rejection. This prophecy was fulfilled in dramatic and horrific ways. Jehu, a new king anointed by God to carry out this justice, entered Jezreel, the city where Jezebel resided. When Jezebel heard the news of Jehu's arrival, she prepared herself, put on makeup, and positioned herself at the palace window to watch the new king's arrival. 2 Kings 9 verse 30. In an act of revenge and fulfillment of prophecy, Jehu ordered his servants to throw Jezebel out the window. Jezebel fell to the ground and was trampled by horses, a scene that highlighted the utter humiliation and disdain she had faced. Later, when the servants went to collect Jezebel's body for a proper burial, they found only fragments. Her hands, feet, and head had been devoured by dogs, while the rest of her body had been torn apart and left exposed. 2 Kings 9 verses 33-37. This fulfillment of prophecy highlighted the severity of God's judgment on Jezebel and symbolized the total destruction of her influence and power. Jezebel's fate served as a powerful warning about divine justice and the inevitable outcome for those who defy and oppose God. Her violent and humiliating death is a reminder that God's justice, even when it seems delayed, ultimately prevails and punishes injustice and idolatry. Jezebel's legacy is a compelling example of how corrupt leadership can wreak deep and lasting havoc on a nation. As Queen of Israel, Jezebel not only promoted the worship of pagan gods, but she also relentlessly persecuted those who upheld the true worship of God. Her negative impact was felt not only in her own time but also for generations to come. Jezebel established a pattern of corruption and cruelty that deeply marked the history of Israel. By promoting idolatry and injustice, she directly challenged the principles that had guided God's people from their earliest days. The worship of Baal and Asherah, which she encouraged, not only led the people away from the worship of Yahweh, but also undermined morality and justice in the kingdom. Jezebel's legacy serves as a warning about the dangers of corrupt leadership and the importance of maintaining moral and spiritual integrity. Her life and actions demonstrate how a leader, when driven by ambition and idolatry, can leave a destructive and lasting impact, undermining justice and turning people away from God's principles. Finally, God's justice prevails.